Great for me to connect briefly as it is. So what I thought I would do in the time I have is to just have a brief update on our welcome strategy and to make sure that the people in the room are familiar with the work of the Wellcome Trust on climate and health. To make a few comments about our interest in climate services in particular, and then to present to you our brand new, and I say brand new, the scheme page went up an hour ago, so it really is brand new. You're the first audience that we're talking about this to, and that's about our Climate Impact Award scheme. So that's what I'm going to cover in the time that I have. So first of all, for those of you not familiar with the Wellcome Trust, it is a trust that was founded in 1936 by the will of Sir Henry Wellcome, who was an American that had landed up in the UK, and he effectively, with his colleague Silas Burroughs, established the first global pharmaceutical company, which was then called Wellcome. The company and the foundation separated in the 70s, and now the Wellcome Trust is politically and financially independent. It is a very wealthy foundation, 38 billion in its endowment. We're based here in London, but we have initiatives that we engage with and resource all around the world. And we are currently planning and engaged in spending over £1.5 billion a year on medical and health research. And we have a commitment from our CEO, Jeremy Farrar, to spend 16 billion over the next 10 years, irrespective of what happens in the financial markets. As of October 2020, we had a new strategic plan and mission statement. And I think this is particularly important for the community to understand what our mission is now and how we plan to implement our mission. So the idea now is that Wellcome supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone. And this means that we are much more focused on delivering impact in the real world. And we're doing this through these three challenge areas which have been established after a long period of consultation on infectious disease, which the Trust is very well known for, mental health, which hasn't had innovative research developments for a very long time, and our programme on climate and health. And we will continue to support discovery science as a core activity at Wellcome. What this means is that in the challenge areas, such as climate and health, we will be looking at the research to impact and partnering with others that can then bring in the implementation aspects. For those of you who are interested in more upstream science, you can still apply for discovery research, which doesn't have to have a direct policy focus. So we also have cross-cutting functions now across the Wellcome Trust, including our data for science and health work and a range of influencing teams, including policy, translation, cultural partnerships, public engagement, etc. So it's a very broad package of activities that are happening here at the Trust to help us deliver our mission. Central to everything that we do is diversity and inclusion and research culture, which will be embedded in everything that we fund going forward. And we have a particular interest in ensuring that our research is undertaken closer, if you like, to the chalk base, closer to where the action is, and in particular supports lower and middle income country researchers going forward. So within the climate and health strategy, we have a vision, a world where catastrophic climate breakdown is averted in a way that allows human health to flourish. And this to me is a very important statement of Wellcome, because it really understands the catastrophic nature of climate change and the urgency with which we need to address it. And our mission statement will be very much putting health at the heart of climate action. And you could say, well, why Wellcome? You know, why now? It's been doing its own path for a long time on discovery science, but I think we've really taken on board that the window to take urgent climate action is closing rapidly. and unless countries dramatically scale up their efforts to counter the climate crisis, the world faces a global catastrophe. And this was a statement made by the Secretary General of the UN recently. And so, despite our knowledge that climate change is the greatest threat to global public health this century, that's been very clearly articulated by the World Health Organization, policymakers are not acting at the speed or scale necessary to mitigate or adapt to the current crisis. So our premise is that advancing the availability and access to research and evidence on the direct and indirect effects of climate change on health will help to inform and accelerate innovation and scaling up of health-enhancing mitigation and adaptation actions by governments, civil society, the private sector, and also by communities. And so within our programme, we have 4 goals. The first 3 are very much evidence development, quantifying the effects of health on health of climate change, identifying the potential benefits of mitigation action, establishing the evidence of the effects of health on health of climate change adaptation action, and then building an underlying capability and field of climate research and policy engagement. And so, in short, we're really trying to think, how can health evidence tip the feasibility scale towards limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees C, in line with the Paris Agreement, and at the same time, how can we best protect vulnerable populations from the effects of climate change we will now inevitably experience. So in the context of climate services, Wellcome has already been engaged, and in fact the book that Neville mentioned was doesn't seem to want to update. Well, it's the Climate Information for Public Health Action. It was actually funded by the Wellcome Trust when I was at Columbia University in New York. We've also, since I arrived 3.5 years ago, partnered with WHO in particular and with the new WHO-WMO joint office, and we were going to hear from Joy Schumacher in this session, but we have enabled them to build a climate health portal that allows very much that intersection between the climate community and the health community to work together. And I think one of the things that we understand very much about the role of climate services in our agenda is that climate adaptation in particular needs to be informed by what is actually happening in the climate in context. And so we need to understand what characteristics of climate make it an additional layer of information for understanding and predicting disease risk. And you will maybe be familiar in the audience, the climatology, the seasonality, the diurnal rhythm, the potential predictability of multiple timescales, all provide valuable information or have the potential to provide valuable information to the health community. And so one of the first calls that we have invested in that was out last year was on putting climate information, integrating climate information into climate sensitive infectious disease models. And this Friday, the awards from that call will be announced. So if you put in for that call, then that's the moment to look at for who got the funding, and you'll see the kind of interesting and innovative work that we're investing in there. We also had a call out on heat adaptation, evaluating interventions to help manage the health effects of heat. Specifically, that call is now closed. We have had the reviews, and the announcements will be made in the coming weeks as to which groups have been funded on heat adaptation. And there, in particular for this call, one of the stipulations was that the call should be led by a principal investigator from a lower or middle income country. And then we've had also a call out of biological vulnerability to extreme heat and maternal and child health. I know some of the audience will have contributed to some of those proposals. We are very excited that we will be reviewing those proposals next week, and hope to be able to announce the awards in due course. So what I want to say here is that although our strategy is relatively new, Welcome has gone through a major process of organisational change over the last couple of years. Our director for the Climate Health Programme only arrived, Alan Dangle, in January of last year, so he's literally been in place for a full year, and yet we have 4 open calls that have gone out to the community at large, starting to move resources to researchers so that we can get active in this space. And the final call that we've had out last year in this early phase is around advancing climate mitigation policy solutions with health co-benefits, and that is limited to G7 countries. So our challenge, one of the interesting things about moving from academia to a research funder is very much trying to support the communities where the knowledge is, such as yourself, and to help shape the opportunities towards really strong policy engagement. And that's the key thing for Welcome Trust in our challenge area. We really want to develop the research that can have the biggest impact, and given the climate change urgency that we face now, and to do that with mechanisms that really respond to that urgency. And so it's because of that I'm really happy to be able to announce our latest which literally went up on our website an hour ago, and it's a climate impact awards scheme. And the first thing is to say, why have I called it a scheme? And it is because we hope to repeat this award each year for the next few years. One of the challenges we know for many researchers is that it's very difficult to put together competitive proposals in a short time, and yet we want the action to happen. We want to be able to make an announcement, get in the proposals and make the awards in the shortest time possible. So this particular award, we have actually moved the time frame from the launch to decision making to 25 weeks, as opposed to normally 33 weeks. Which means the launch is today, the decision making will be in July. This means we have the onus on the research community to come together with impactful proposals, highly competitive proposals in a relatively short time period. And we will help you with as much as we can through the scheme page by explaining exactly what we are looking for. And the aim of this scheme is really to make the impact of climate change visible across a wide range of health outcomes, including both mental and physical health, in order to drive urgent climate policy and practice change at scale. And the motivation for this call really came from not only recent reports that have emerged, A, on the urgency issues, and but B, on the fact that even though global policymakers, national policymakers, the society at large has generally accepted that climate change is happening, but still people see it as a thing of the future and not of the present. And of course, we know that we need to act now on the mitigation side, we need to act now on the adaptation side, if we are to protect our society in general and vulnerable communities in particular. So we're looking here to say, we're not looking for global research that will inform the global policy makers, but research that will target particular policy opportunities, whether that's at the national scale, could be at the city scale, could be a particular sector, where change is possible within the next 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And so we've looked to fund transdisciplinary teams to deliver short-term, high-impact projects, combining evidence generation with communications and public engagement. And there's some really significant gaps that have been identified, and this is a paper by Lorraine Ford that came out in 21, where air pollution, yes, there's a lot of work that's been done on that, but climate change, return on child health, nutrition, mental health, other areas have not received the same level of focus, and in particular lower middle income countries and disadvantaged populations. The evidence gaps there need to be addressed while elevating the voices of those most affected. So that's what we intend. We hope that you will be able to do with this call, and the call is launched today. Proposal deadline is the 13th. This is all on the scheme page. The scheme page is easy to find, and I'll give you a link at the end. The shortlisting will be completed in early June. We'll have our committee meeting in mid-July, and awards will be made shortly after that. The expected duration of grants, we really want these to be short, sharp impact. Grants will be 2 to 3 years. We would accept earlier, and the expected budget range is about 1 to 2.5 million. And so what we're looking for is anybody anywhere in the world can apply except for mainland China. There are some other grant conditions you'll find on the website. The funding I've mentioned, the duration I've mentioned, and the career stage. These are not early career grants because it requires you coming in effectively with an established team or experience in how to pull together a really strong team in a very short time period. However, we hope that mid-career or senior researchers will bring in younger investigators to help with the process. And what we're looking for in the team is those who have a track record on research on the impact of climate change on health, who work with communities most affected by climate change, who can work in collaboration with policymakers and implementers, decision makers involved in delivering climate solutions, have experience in designing and planning research projects in collaboration with in-country implementation partners, governments, NGOs, etc., and experience in designing and delivering communication and public engagement activities that are responsive to the expressed needs and interests of the at-risk communities. So that's all I'm going to say to you today. I really hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting. This slide here has the website. You just need to go to welcome.org and look up climate and health, and you'll find it there.
Magdalene, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for doing this at short notice. You'll note that I see Curry and Tandy have already completed their proposal, which they're about to submit to you for your next. I just want to say, if you have a moment, I know you have to go, that we had a cracker session yesterday on extreme climate events, and noted that we have to distinguish between extreme weather events and extreme climate events, because you know, a lot of people think of extreme events as something that happens suddenly in days or hours, as opposed to droughts or other climate events that are more insidious. And why this is important is because the government in South Africa is busy launching the National Framework for Climate Services. And we are trying to develop this idea of a research alliance around this. So I think this is really timeless for us to potentially use this call as a way to consolidate this. I guess I have one question for you, and that is, I see that you use the term climate change across all the literature that you have. But in light of what I just said about our extreme events, how do we approach climate variability and extremes, or changing averages or changing variability in that definition of climate change in terms of what the Wellcome Trust is seeking? Thanks.
Oh, that's such a brilliant question. So in a nutshell, we understand climate change is like a political term, I would say. Obviously, there's a scientific, understanding of what climate change is, But when you go for, and which is important, particularly on the mitigation arguments, but when you go to adaptation, we have to adapt to the climate that exists, not the climate that is just the trend line. We have to adapt to the variability, to the extremes, and to the trend. It's all the climate that we will experience. And in particular, we have early indications that this year might be an El Nino. That to me is a great opportunity to educate the community about the relationship between variability and change. Yeah. So I think that's just a really important thing to show that we have to help people understand. One of the things we'll do at Welcome is try and think through what is the language that we can communicate that best with. You know, that variability and change are what we experience.
Right, and I mean, I think in the proposals that we write, it's also important to make that connection very clear, how the relationship between variability and change in the trend. Great. We did agree that we would release you at 20 past. So we thank you all very, very much for your time, and expect a whole launch of proposals to arrive at our desk shortly from here. Okay. Thanks again.
I think we're really good ones is what we did.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
All right. That's excellent. Okay, so we were very privileged to have that opportunity, and because of the time we have, we've been able to include Jeanette's presentation as a full-on one. So, Jeanette, the floor is yours.
Please don't forget to share the screen.
Oh, hold on, I have to share the screen. There, share the screen. Then do this. All right, we're good to go. Yeah, you want to find that. Okay, all yours. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a bit meeting to speak after Madam, but I'll try and do justice as best as I can. So yeah, so I'm going to just briefly give some report on the NDC, the inclusion of health into the NDC, and some of the adaptation actions that were proposed by the latest ANDC. Just to give you a feel also for what the NDC, you know, what we do with it, what we can do with the data that's available, and so on. So, very briefly, you know, preparation and communication of the NDC is necessary to reflect progress towards as high as possible national climate ambition. And the adaptation component is one of the primary vehicles to share individual country efforts and commitment on adaptation. The NDC provides opportunities to promote synergies between climate action and other development priorities. And it has a focus on economic sectors with the highest potential for resource efficiency, climate mitigation, and adaptation. So the adaptation priorities need to address the conditions that makes communities variable, and that necessitates the inclusion of sectors such as health. And initiatives identified in the NDC that identify existing initiatives, so it doesn't develop new ones, but initiatives that are there that are reported have the potential to translate into significant health benefits. So the NDA actually identified health as a key sector because sectors are decided on by a country, you know, what key sectors are. So health is one has been defined as one of the key sectors. So we use the risk and vulnerability framework as presented in the fifth assessment report of the UN panel on climate change, and this has also been adopted by the National Climate Risk and Vulnerability Framework that was developed a few years ago. So, just briefly looking at climate hazards, it sort of has a risk approach which changed from the previous approach, which was a vulnerability approach. Looking at climate hazards like extreme events, gradual trends, and direct climate impacts such as heat waves, floods, landslides, then leading to exposure to these hazards from humans or ecosystems, whatever. For example, outdoor workers, as we know, that is a big topic and an important one at the moment. Vulnerability consists of, is defined by the sensitivity and the coping ability or adaptive capacity of those exposed to the hazards. And there are a whole lot of hosts, and I think already also referred to a lot of that this morning. And then the combination of interaction between these are then presented as the risk. I guess a lot of you know that already, so sorry if I'm preaching to converted or to those who know, but yeah, just to set the scene. So the framework was used to explore high-risk elements of the health sector, and readily information was used, as I said. So temperatures for current and future climate scenarios were simulated at 8 meter spatial resolution, and hot days and very hot days, some were used to determine exposure to current and affected climate conditions, physical hazards, such as temperature. Well, in this case, I'm talking about temperature. Vulnerability, we use the district health barometer and census data to try and characterize vulnerability, and also look at physical hazards such as foodborne, vector-borne diseases, things that are associated with extremes in temperatures and that can pre-existing diseases basically that can affect vulnerability. And sensitivity, like as defined by health status, nutritional status, and coping. Examples of that as measured by density distribution of health workers, or indicators of access to services such as clean drinking water, drinkable water. Yeah. So the factors identified, the plan of the whole idea around that is to use it to inform the identification of adaptation needs. And I guess you know as well as I do that, you know, there are lots of caveats with that, because of the resolution of the data and the quality and how it's being, you know, collected and so on. But so the better the data is, obviously, the better we can report. So just in terms of exposure to hot days, to give you some examples of the current and the future, or the projected temperatures. So the baseline just showed, as indicated by number of hot days, shows that the baseline climate varies across the country, with a few days in the east, also along the coast, and the highest in the Northern Cape, which we've also experienced a while ago. And in terms of the projected exposure, as shown by a simulated increase in the number of future hot days, shows the largest areas in the east, northern areas, outside South Africa. So, just to show you some of the vulnerability data that we use, just to kind of set the scene to look at, you know, overweight obese adults, severe acute malnutrition. That's the types of data that is available. This is now provincial level, but this is also at the highest available at district level. And in terms of coping, indicators such as distribution of hospital beds, 5,000 people, target population, districts of pipe water inside the house, health worker density. These are very simplified indicators, obviously, and if one really wants to, one has to look at much more integrating these indicators and interrogating them. Yeah, I think actually I'm not going to go into, but maybe just to say, look at the current state of situation, climate change hazards and the impacts it could have on health. And then we see looks at the projection of exposure and risks in the period from 2021 to 2030. So this is just to show how we displayed coping or adaptation ability between different provinces. using information. This is not all the indicators, but just some of the indicators that to show the reach being the where the province reaches the highest from all the province, the highest most or least able to cope if we use that indicator. And then okay, so and then sensitivity, again we use things like formal gradings, households, female households and the likes to give an indication of sensitivity. And I mean there's a lot, some of the indicators debatable whether it's addresses coping or sensitivity, and some of them like housing, you know, the what the house is made of can be sensitivity or can be coping, and other factors around the household can be sensitivity. So I think that's something that also need to be need to decide on what do we actually want to show, and what do we want to do with the indicators that we use. So just some adaptation measures that we use readily available data. Like obviously early warning systems, information portals, strengthening of provincial preparedness and response, and education material on climate diseases that increase community awareness, especially for community health workers. So in terms of the concluding thoughts, we sort of conclude that the standardization of the CRV, the climate environmental methodology, I don't know how many people use the methodology that was developed, that should assist in the comparison of indicators across different sectors and between and across different studies. And it will be good to see how many stakeholders actually use the methodology to, when they do their work and they assess vulnerability. But at the time, the willingness of stakeholders to engage hasn't been determined yet. Changes on mortality and morbidity is affected by factors such as change in medical treatment, infrastructure, and lifestyle. That sometimes may have a greater effect on mortality than climate change. So there's other non-climate indicators are very important. And some diseases like asthma are aggravated, but it's also other things. So the foundation of successful interventions like adaptation comes, I think, what part of it is to go back to basics and to strengthen the effectiveness of the health system and the way that people are actually being helped. I want to just actually show some of the issues that came up yesterday. Just from the extremes event that I just sort of put out there, and then I want to very quickly, because I think actually it's important for us going forward in terms of the systemic effect of the systemic nature of vulnerability in health and climate change. And I'll just go through this quickly. It's a bit of a random graph, so I hope it's not too much, but it's about setting goals and to find out what are the challenges, and then to look at, okay, what do we know about the challenges that we are facing? So in the climate context, what are the drivers of it's generally, but also in terms of climate, what drive the challenges that we face, that put pressures on the different environments, and climate pressures maybe, increased greenhouse gas emissions, temperature, precipitation, variability, things like that. But also to recognize that there are also the pressures are neutral, so can also have positive benefits or opportunities. For example, but benefits could be like land use change, which actually give opportunity for other types of crops and so on. And then looking at hazards, different hazards on the environment, but in terms of climate hazards, increased temperatures, your direct impacts, your direct hazards and your direct impacts, things like flooding and drought. Yesterday we also spoke about wind changing and wind strength and so on. So in terms of the state looking at the availability and the quality of resources. And in the climate context, the temperature, I mean, there may be many caveats and mistakes in this, but this is just an attempt to look at different temperatures and so on. And then looking at what the exposures are, direct exposures, indirect, leading to vulnerabilities, what are the indicators and the factors that affect that, affect the coping ability. When you're fortunate that it's having up here, but to look at vulnerability to what, when you actually look at that, because that affects what is important, and that relates into the risk. Yeah, so vulnerability to what, and then just nearly done. The risks and things, the effects on human health and well-being, which can be adverse, but can also be that's associated with an impaired, system, your state of your natural, economic, social system. But it can also have positive effects. If the temperature increase, people, there are health benefits as well. So that outcome should be measured by appropriate indicators, looking at cause-effect relationships, and how that affects. And then what is the desired state that we need? In terms of experiential evidence, but also in research-based evidence, and who are the people that are important. So it's not just research, but scenarios, communities, other sectors. And I just added the desired futures framework because somebody mentioned that it's really something that, and looking back, those who are at CSR will remember the goal and the obstacles and turning into positive outcomes, which say what is required to actually turn these into opportunities and positive outcomes, and to keep in mind that the desired state and the things that gets towards that can also have unintended consequences or negative impacts, which can then cause different hazards. But we are obviously focused on positive outcomes, and then sort of the social or the softer issues associated with that, like changing mindsets, and things like that, strengthening of community actions, identifying assets and what people have. And then all of these, actions are important at all of these levels. And to me, it's if we have all these different talks, I always wonder, okay, so at what level does this person, where does the work that they do fit in, and the actions and the people who actually do it, and that to be able to actually have positive impacts, which then can feed back into policy, and then that's some of the things that we know. So, but in terms of the positive impacts, to look at the total picture and be able to look at all sectors, not in terms of one place. This is the last one. This is just looking at outcomes mapping and seeing, okay, who does what do we want to achieve, to look at what do we want to achieve and how can we all work towards that, rather than getting stuck on and then finding what the issues and the challenges are, so that it's not competing with people's interests, but that we all can think of what is the best, where do we want to be, and what do we need to get there so that everybody can do it. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jeanette. I think you said to me it was called the horrendous plan. It's very helpful, I think. I mean, it shows a process of thinking which I think we should engage with. And I wanted to say also that I remember when we were talking to the disaster management people, how they indicated to us that much of their calculation of risk is not so much on the hazard, but the capability of the system to respond to the hazard, respond to the risk. That's a component of risk which you've highlighted. So I think that's very helpful. Thank you very much for that. Mostly impromptu talk to short notice. We're going to move on. I forgot who's next. It's you, Nada. Okay, great. So Nada is up next. So, Nada's from the MRC, and we have her presentation, and then we have 3 after that until tea time. And then, as I said yesterday, the best presentation is coming off the tea. Don't go away. Okay, I'm joking. Oh, obviously, second. Where's that? All right, the floor is yours. Thank you. I can try it up or down? Down, up. 18, I'll put it at 20. Right. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm Maria from the Biostatistics Research Unit with the MRC. I'll be the presenter today on behalf of my other co-authors, looking at the various vectors to inform the area control and the health and stuff. So vector-borne diseases, we know that vectors transmit pathogens from infected hosts to susceptible hosts. And vector-borne diseases are projected to be impacted greatly by climate change in terms of their intensity as well as the range and distribution. So almost all vector-borne diseases are or have already been impacted by climate, and this can occur through multiple pathways. So because we know that vectors are physically connected and responsive and highly responsive to their environments, as Patrick was alluded to there in his presentation. So because they can alter the life cycle, as well as the reproduction rates and their survival, and whether they are able to thrive or not in particular habitats. So it's been estimated that disease carrying mosquitoes could reach 500 million more people by 2050. And malaria is one of those diseases that is considered one of the top vector-borne diseases that will be impacted by climate change. And it's currently still a concern, a major concern in sub-Saharan Africa, as it causes more than 600,000 deaths annually, particularly in children under the age of 5 years old. And within South Africa, there have been, it's endemic in three regions, so the Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and KwaZulu-Natal, mostly the Limpopo and Mpumalanga. And it has been targeted, or it had been targeted for elimination by 2020, but this has been now revised to 2025, and there have been outbreaks. So for example, in 2017, there were 28,000 cases, but even reports from last year, late last year, there were still outbreaks happening. A lot of the cases that were occurring, because we believe the example in lockdown, it was a bit slightly reduced because most of the cases within South Africa are imported from neighboring countries. So during COVID lockdown, it actually dropped the numbers, but as things borders opened up, that resulted in more important cases. So let me just go to the policy. So there have been studies that looked at climate suitability in relation to malaria transmission, so at a global and continental scale, but nothing has been done locally within South Africa. And we aim to look at how climate change will affect or influence the habitat suitability for malaria vectors across South Africa. And the focus here is particularly on malaria vectors because without the vector, there's no disease. So you have to consider how the vector operates and behaves and how that's going to be impacted, not just the resulting malaria cases within people. So basically, like, as I said, because we've been seeing that there have been outbreaks happening and there's no real explanation other than climate. So that means that possibly the vectors themselves are changing how they're behaving, for example, their biting rates and so on, or if they're moving or not. So we need to look at that, and because it's not just within South Africa, we also have to consider the climate within neighboring countries because vectors can move between borders. So currently the vector control methods are aimed at reducing the biting rates as well as controlling vectors themselves, but with the genetic composition of populations are changing within the Anopheles mosquito populations. And like we said, the climate and land use change could also influence the global malaria rates of transmission. So we do need to consider how, again, the vectors are operating, because the vector control methods are not as effective as they used to be. So our methods were, we couldn't get the actual data from various agencies. So NICD, for example, we weren't able to source that, and especially because we had 6 months to complete this project. So we decided to look at literature and source the occurrence of various malaria vectors from 1990 all the way up to 2020. So we looked at various species of vectors, and we considered 11 abiotic factors or variables. So things related to temperature, precipitation. We looked at also habitats, so farmland, crop, the trees, the vegetation, and also the slope of water bodies. And we use various scenarios for climate projection as well as future land use projections. And we used species distribution models, specifically looking at presence-only techniques, because we only had records of where the mosquitoes occurred, but not where they didn't occur. So for that, you need to kind of use something called the pseudo absence, which is where you do like a random selection of where you assume the absences are. And then you kind of use different kind of sensitivity analysis or techniques to vary that random selection. And then we use the modeling, ensemble modeling approach, so different approaches. And then from that modeling, you kind of come up with a best model based on AUC, TSS, and voice indices. And yeah, so we looked at different projections, and we did this within South Africa. We also extended it towards Africa, but I'm not going to show that here. But we just wanted to see whether that corresponded with what the experts' opinions had projected or predicted for malaria expansion or distribution. So in 2020, we can see that the regions that are endemic, obviously, so KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga had a high suitability, whereas from 2030 to 2070, the areas that increased in suitability were in Eastern Cape, Free State, Gauteng, and the Northwest. So when you consider temperature thresholds, so basically temperatures that are suitable for malaria transmission, it indicates that there wasn't a region within South Africa that was suitable for endemic malaria, but rather seasonal or moderate malaria transmission. And so those for seasonal transmission, it was KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Northwest, and Gauteng. Whereas for moderate transmission and high vector suitability, Gauteng and Northwest. So we also looked at populations at risk based on two different scenarios, and based on the moderate suitability, it is estimated that from 5 million, the risk will increase to 32 million. And within the seasonal transmission suitability, in those areas that are seasonally transmission suitable, that will increase to about 8 million people. So basically, we have that, there's going to be increased habitat suitability for multiple malaria vectors. And these are more for seasonal moderate and not so much endemic malaria. And there is a possible increase in the total population living in areas being more at risk in those areas. And under those projections, we're moving from endemic regions to non-endemic regions such as Eastern Cape, Free State, Gauteng, and Northwest. And under the different population or socioeconomic projections, so if we consider a kind of a medium kind of population growth and urbanization, then you'll expect that regions will be better focused on sustainable goals. There will be a potential of reducing the populations at risk. And there would be more investment in sustainable practices. Whereas if there's high population growth with low urbanization, then it's likely that priorities will shift towards food demands rather than sustainable goals.
And the implications are, like I said, South Africa's already missed their elimination targets, and that could be because we're not looking specifically at the vectors themselves, but we're looking at the cases and we're not really understanding or collecting enough data within those regions to determine what is actually happening to the vectors. And so we decided to take this forward, and we hope to maybe expand these kind of this study into actually collecting data within those regions. And we know that malaria control needs to consider all aspects. So it's malaria cases, the humans, the environment, as well as the vectors. And we aim to do this by, installing kind of weather stations or eye buttons and collecting more. So in specific regions, so not looking just at microclimates, but I mean not macroclimates, but like microclimates as well, to see what's happening. So thank you for the British Council for their funding as well as my interest.
Educate me, what are eye buttons?
They're mini sensors and other sensors, so they collect temperature, humidity, weather, and things like that.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's very exciting research, and I think the climate and malaria modelers in the room here would have heard this and thought about, I don't know what kind of habitat type suitability thinking has gone into the models, but that's really something very interesting to look at. And also to think about not so much where malaria is becoming, or where vector habitat is increasing, but also where it's decreasing, because I think it's not just expanding ranges, it's changing ranges, which is really important. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. I had something else, but I've forgotten. Michael, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess this is very eye-opening because we do need a long-term prediction of what could happen, like suitability. I just want to know, did you consider using vaccine modeling for suitability, maybe?
No, because we only had presence at this point. So for accent, we need both presences and absences. But if we do happen to come across that data, then we could try to use. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I wonder if genetic events are less good predictors of malaria suitability transmission, considering the effect of technological improvement around socio-economic variables. For example, around housing moving, so people are getting more protected against vector bites, and even the issue, I mean the picture of net. So should we consider those aspects, and to the detriment of temperature, for example, and other weather events?
So we consider land use because we that does affect how malaria is transmitted, because it's also dependent on the density of populations for the regions. But the thing is also, like I said, with nets and things are, even though they are effective, but other vector control methods are becoming less effective. So in terms of the malaria mosquito itself, like things like IRS and those, they're becoming less effective, so people are becoming more vulnerable or sensitive to that. But the malaria is affected by its weather as well. So it's like, or it's climate itself. So we needed, so that's why we consider just weather and as well as the land use. But not, we haven't included other variables. That answers your question.
I wanted to just say that it's also interesting to look at suitability of habitat for the parasite as well as the vector, because I know, if I understand it, that there are some situations where it's too hot for the parasite, even though the vector is present. That's one issue. And then the other thing I wanted to just check on is what we mean by endemic areas. Do we mean traditional areas where there's always been malaria, As opposed to, the reason I'm confused by that is because in South Africa, as you pointed out, we often have immigrant cases. I don't know what the right term is. Imported cases, right? And so we see those cases here and there, and then perhaps they lead to a local outbreak. Or is that a sign of endemism? In other words, how do we reconcile the imported bits with the endemism? This is just things that are floating in my head. Just have a few minutes left until we move on.
So, yeah, I get your point. So like, it's, so example, I can consider it as more endemic because it's just kind of, it's like low levels, it's constantly there. Whereas places like Limpopo and Mpumalanga, even though there are endemics and they've always had malaria, but they're more prone to these outbreaks because they are coming in and out in and out. So I think there's a bit of confusion about the actual definitions, but I think in this case we just mean that it's traditionally just been malaria has been endemic in these areas. It's been present within these areas.
Thanks. One more. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such a good presentation. I saw your maps. You really selected your study area, and to me, I feel like they are a little bit negative. What do you think in the future malaria is going to expand beyond the boundaries that you choose, especially in South Africa, because we expect a shift even in terms of climate and so on. And I don't think your maps really the shift, especially moving into the future. And another thing is that I would actually love to see your area and so on, just to see that the validity of the liability. Thank you.
Okay, so we chose those areas because that's, like I said, that's where it's endemic, but there are no other regions within South Africa currently that have malaria. So that's where we base our occurrences on, but the projections are based on how climate will change in other regions and how that risk will move to other regions. So like I said, it's from our results, it kind of shows that it might move to like Eastern Cape, Free State, outside of those places where it's currently not available. And in terms of days, yeah, I didn't present it, but yeah, we have about I think 0.9 or 90% accuracy for the final model that we use.
Nada, thank you very much. We're going to recruit you into our JSPS project now. Thank you. Well, we have Michael Pillay from Nagasaki via Johannesburg. He's a South African, and he was through our IDU's collaboration with our Japanese colleagues. We got him to Japan, and he's at Necken, which he'll tell you about. So we're very glad to have you come home, and looking forward to your final coming home, so we can get you going in research in South Africa. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
So yes, I'm Necken Institute of Tropical Medicine in Nagasaki University. I believe we have an assistant school in London. And yes, the goal is like global medicine and global health. And my research will specifically be looking at global health from a climate framework, specifically in this case, using the application of deep learning transformer model to model malaria incidents under the same climate framework. So my model is basically there to be on the ground implementation, not something to like predict far into the future. It's to help people now if they want. So the background, I was lucky enough that two people have already given similar data about this, but yeah, the cases you can see malaria cases have increased by 2 million from 2021, with also deaths, and majority of them are in Africa. And the mortality rates have also increased in 19 countries by 20% recently. So again, the WHO goals for decreasing malaria mortality rate by 75% won't be met by 2025. Just some background on the climate from the IPCC report, we can see with malaria again, they also agree that it is a disease along with other vector-borne diseases such as dengue, that will increase in terms of impact and risk if the global temperatures were to rise. And yeah, we already know that climatic conditions, from precipitation, temperature, humidity, and the IUD, modes of variability have influence of malaria transmission through the vectors, and as the word said, that as well. And climate change also will have an increase for this potential. But basically, how can we leverage using climate to predict this relationship that we have between the vectors and climate? And one of the main pillars outlined by the WHO in earlier reports was using surveillance and early warning to help combat malaria. And one of the ways to do an early warning is create an early warning system, which is modeling. And this is where my study comes in. It's using the climate data to basically predict malaria cases. Specifically, I'm using a deep learning transformer model with attention, and this is very special. It's what makes it a bit more different than your classical machine learning models and your other time series deep learning models. And I will also be comparing it to statistical models that exist for malaria prediction and XGBoost, just to show a classic approach for machine learning. And we'll evaluate the prediction accuracies with under classification and regression based. So why deep learning precisely? Usually people say you need large amounts of data and so on. And yes, as we get better and better data and more deep learning models become more effective for us, as their performance tends to outdo those of the simple statistical and other machine learning models. And now explainability is also becoming possible in deep learning, as I'll show you later. And they tend to help help fill in the limitations that exist in models or statistical ones have, such as the prediction for time, dealing with many variables and especially retention, which is memory across prediction time space. And yeah, so just some past studies would have started looking into deep learning and machine learning. They've all taken to using similar kind of variables. However, the problem is kind of data. They are limited to monthly and annual malaria data. And yeah, you can see accuracies are fairly good. And it's still a field in its infancy and needs a lot more work because, as we know, malaria is very complex, and it's not just climate, there's lots of human variables as well. But for now, we are trying a simple approach that we can use if needed for an early warning system that's practical. So my data is actually daily data. We managed to get this from the Limpopo Department of Health. And yes, there is one Limpopo as well. And so we also use daily precipitation and temperature data from 1998 up to 2021. These are just the three models again, some specifics of them, and I won't go into so much detail right now. What I want to outline is the model architecture for my model, which uses the attention mechanism, and I want to outline why this is quite relevant. It's because it's a relatively new form in the deep learning space, and it helps us to focus on the most relevant data, the most important data in the time series when you're trying to train your models. And it also allows the model to not forget that data. So even if you're predicting for 2021, it's still going to remember what happened. It's still going to remember those relationships between, say, temperature, rainfall, and the malaria incidents that happened way down in the historical past in 1998 even, and it's won't drop off like usually other models do. So, and it also allows explainability, which has been a big problem with deep learning models, because people always say it's a black box. This is now the black box that's open, so we can see how the model would take in the inputs, transform them, and then move them towards making a prediction. The context, but the main thing is to just understand the overall potential. So this is just a bit of an example of the model predicting for malaria. As you can see, the predictions are quite good, and this is at a daily level. My transformer model does do this at daily compared to other models which are limited to like monthly or weekly. It doesn't need to be daily because it's very fine, but the fact that it's able to do it quite well is okay. And then here we're able to extract the importance of the variables for making these predictions, and so the model can inform us. In this case, temperature, rainfall, quite high up there. Obviously, you have to initiate it to make it know that it's giving the time to, so you use things like a transform, further amount, and for that. Just a simple form of the attention. For instance, what it can also do is focus on part of the data, like the gray line is the attention, and it shows us, for instance, say you have high rainfall, but it's not the malaria season. The model is going to understand that context. So it's not just going to be like, oh, high rainfall. Let's say there's going to be high malaria. So it takes context into consideration as well. In fact, this high attention is what ChatGPT is. So that's how it's quite good at, taking context and doing good translations and coming up with good outputs. Yeah. My model during training, so this is the training process, the way it learns. So it will start off, it basically learns like a human, because that's what deep neural nets are. It's, just copying the brain structure. So in the beginning, it's not going to really know, but as it goes along, as it trains for more epochs, from epoch 0 to 2000, 5,000, 10,000, we can see the model's prediction on the data it's been trained on is becoming better and better. Now these are the actual results. So the lines in black, these are for the three models, the statistical, the XGBoost, machine learning, and my model. So the lines in black are basically the malaria data. These are basically for 2 years from 2020 to 2021. And you can see the statistical model tends to overestimate in a lot of cases, and as you move to the end of the prediction period, it drops off drastically with accuracy. The XGBoost, since it's this is the regression version, also the classification. There's a lot of ways, and also because the data kind of has class imbalances, and there's a lot of zeros. You have also take consideration about maybe for my model, we see the prediction on the test is quite good, which is expected because the model is familiar with that data. However, when you give it new data, which is in there, it's able to still predict quite well. And we can see with the actual regression rates, accuracy metrics of regression, MAE, R squared, and so on, the transformer tends to do better. And also with your F1, F2 scores, which I decided to use to also look at the accuracy at predicting a high confidence, and the transformer again tends to do much better. Just some AUC curves, just to also get because when you're classifying data, sometimes class imbalances can skew the accuracy, and you might think you have high accuracy, but the model doesn't actually have good classification capacity, and we can see that with the statistical model, and the AUC is quite low. The transform model again scores the highest compared to the XGBoost. And so it's more accurate and classified than the intensity of malaria. So this is not a classification, and we did low, medium, and high malaria classes. So high would be like a 90th percentile outbreak and so on. And we can see, except for medium, the transformer tends to do better. The statistical kind of zero bar with 54, it's not that high. Overall accuracy was 98% for mine, 79 for the zero bar statistical. However, this one used malaria kind of as a predictor inside. So it's a bit, it's okay for implementation, but maybe overall prediction accuracy isn't that good. Just some more classification metrics for high, medium, and low. The main things are like sensitivity, specificity, and balance accuracy. And we can see in a lot of the classes, statistical performs quite well, even especially at low, but that could be due to class imbalance. Probably. However, like the transformer does quite well for itself compared to the other models. Being quite high. Just for a summary, between the three models, accuracy, we have 98 for the transformer, and especially again, resolution, we predicting weekly for the statistical. The XT boost can be daily, and the transformer also daily. So when you take into account that you're able to get such high accuracy at a daily level, I think it's quite relevant, especially if you want to use this in the real world. The time steps ahead, of course, this is the statistical is limited to 16 weeks. After that, its accuracy decreases. The transformer is being tested longer, and it has the capability of being longer, provided you feed it more variables. For this case, we were just testing the vanilla scenario, just using temperature and rainfall, so we could compare with our existing models. And AUC is very important because it shows the actual probability of the model to make these predictions accurately, and again, the transformer does well. The problem is training time. These two are basically immediate. The transformer can take 2 weeks up to 2 months to train, depending on how much data you put in. But once it's trained, then you can use it and implement it easily. It's just the training process, the initial process that takes time. So in conclusion, overall, leveraging climate data with with deep learning can inform future malaria incidents better than statistical options, but it doesn't discount statistical methods or the other methods, which are better for maybe shorter predictions because it's faster and easier to do. And overall, deep learning indicates a promising future for malaria and other disease prediction, especially when they are linked to climate. Because we have lots of climate data, and we're going to keep having more quality data coming in as is, and so on. And so we will be able to then maybe tackle other health challenges related to climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. I've got a couple of questions. So just, I mean, it looks really astounding and great and very, very exciting. My question is the reliability of prediction and the phase of the deterioration of confidence over time. So what we had been thinking all the time was, and this is on Limpopo data, this is based on one, so possibly very dependent on the accurate incidence data to keep this going. But the idea is to say, let's look at the season using an approach like we heard earlier. What does the season look like? And if we have a high risk season, we deploy a model like this, which is much more short term in terms of its output. How long, so what happens to the predictions over longer periods of time? When you said 365 days, does it remain as accurate at day 365 as it does at day 12?
The model accuracy that's calculated there is like for the overall 365 days. So I haven't done an accuracy check to see if it's been as accurate, but if we like looked at the actual prediction, you can kind of see it gets it kind of makes more mistakes towards the end of the prediction period, which is expected. So you're getting further away, and there's also other factors that the model may not take into. We still haven't added the other variables
Right.
and so on. But just to say, what I found with testing with multiple variables compared to just temperature and rainfall, these models do very well because it's able to take in variability data and all the other weather variables, and it can basically learn the most important relationship
Right.
and then create a prediction without the noise of preliminarity problems or the things that we usually have.
And I mean, I think that it's great that we can have these various approaches, which can then be evaluated against each other. Not just these models, but I'm saying various approaches at different time scales to be able to say things. And then the variables, and that's up to the malaria community to tell you. Like, for example, immigration is going to be really important. And so how many people have moved across the border in the last couple of weeks, for example? If we can get a time series like that to learn and habitat suitability changes and so on and so forth. So that opens the door to this. I see that it's very computationally quite demanding, but only to set it up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Once
this
it's
is
opt-
for training.
Yeah.
Once it's trained.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. We have a question. And we do that one and take this again.
You mentioned that the transformer model takes quite a while to train, 2 to 2 months, but once it's up and running, obviously you can. So is it case specific? As in, since you train it on an appropriate data, you can now just reapply it to new data set from local being transfer that same model to, let's say, Mozambique or something. Would you have to do the retraining again?
Yeah, that's like a very good question, and it's something we still won't have about. Of course, there is a thing when you're training these models, you can use data augmentation techniques to train it on data that isn't actually malaria data, that has similar characteristics. So technically, if we wanted to use this model for dengue or another vector-based vector-borne disease, we could use the model that's already trained and then initiate it. That's actually part of my future studies to look at. However, we do, it would be nice to actually train the model on actual dengue data, for instance, or actually new data, because, for instance, dengue versus malaria, there's different reactions between the vectors and temperature and rainfall. And there's also lag problems and so on. So it would be valuable to train it with the actual place, the region, the weather data and the malaria data for the area you want to predict.
I mean, I think it would be critical if you're changing species, if the relationship change. It'd be very interesting to look at what it would do, the same model in a different area with the same species. So, will this work? If it works in the purple, will it work in the Malacca? Will it work in Durban?
The thing is,
Unlikely because of climate change, but yeah, it becomes very real.
so it's kind of like once you train it, we say it's a neural network because it behaves and thinks kind of like how humans would think. So once a human knows, okay, rainfall and temperature, there's this relationship between the disease, then the models could also do that. Even though the relationship might be changed, it could then learn, okay, this new data, something else is happening. So it will change the way it learns and then adjust for that because it's using weights and stuff. And it's always changing the weights during the training. So it's possible.
All right. Almost out of time. Actually, out of time. I'm going to allow you 2 more questions. One minute.
Thank you so much. Your studies are very interesting. I'm looking at your vision accuracy metrics. Is that absolute and that means in absolute error?
I was asked it.
So the reason why I'm asking, like I see those negatives, maybe we can negate.
Yeah. Yeah, so when it's negative, it actually means the model is I guess after it's actually performing much less better than we wanted to. It's doing the opposite. Instead of when there's a negative, it's predicting positive and positive and negative, I guess. In this case, that was the value that I don't know.
Thanks. Sarah's last one.
Nice presentation, Michael. I just wanted to ask, so if I understand correctly, your model is, it's kind of like a time-based model. Tonight you had to sort of extrapolate this. How could, is it possible to take it and make it like a spatial model in that sense? Because I assume you use malaria data from one point, rainfall from like the close fire station as well, and how possible then is it to take those points, that sort of point-based measurement on a larger scale, and is that going to break out the computers?
No, actually, the model, the PyTorch package that I kind of used, the transformer model is broken there. It does allow you to use multiple variables and spatial variables. So you could use multiple time series from different locations and create output like that. I haven't done that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, transformation to that and think of control about the super. Okay, so Sarah's up next. Sarah's a local, and well, I think you have the ARC, is that right?
Yes,
Yeah, but you had a previous life.
yeah, this is from our previous slide.
Good, thanks, Sarah.
I almost took to the comments. Hello, everybody. So today's talk, I'll be presenting on some of my recent work looking at spatial temporal characteristics of the Universal Thermal Climate Index, which essentially characterizes human thermal comfort. And we focused on Southern Africa for this, for the period of 1979 to 2021. So this I've done with, I was at UFS for a couple of months doing a postdoc, and this was some of my work from my postdoc. And I'm not going to be presenting on all the results, but we've recently published some work. So if you'd like to see some of the other results, you can go and check out our paper. So for our study, we've considered Southern Africa as the African region south of approximately 16 degrees. And what's really key about this region is it's highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Essentially, is that obvious? Oh, it's sun. Okay, so essentially,
You just have to evacuate now, but
okay, I can carry on. But essentially, the region is highly vulnerable to climate change, and this is largely due to high poverty levels. And at least most countries are classified as low and lower middle income countries. So dealing with things like heat stress, it's not necessarily a #1 priority for the region. And another concerning fact is that the region is warming quite substantially, and it's almost up to 2 degrees. The rate of warming is almost as high as 2 degrees more than the global average. So that's quite substantial. And along with this, we're also seeing an increase in things like the intensity of heat waves, as well as their frequency. So this means that our population is increasingly being subjected to incidences of heat stress. And, you know, that's something that we wanted to look at for this study. And what we wanted to do was essentially to give some thought on, you know, what is Southern Africa's thermal climatology like? So when it comes to thinking of the thermal climatology, we look to thermal comfort. And there are several different factors that actually come to influence our thermal comfort. So we look at the environment, the outdoor environment, which is air temperature, your radiant temperature, which is essentially like a measure of temperature emitted from surfaces. And then we also look at velocity of the air, so wind speed, as well as relative humidity. And then there are also personal factors such as clothing insulation, the metabolic rates of your body, as well as things like the level of activity
your level of activity. So all of this we took into account, and the reason we applied this universal thermal climate index model is because it was a model that had never been applied across Southern Africa, and it took into account more than just the meteorological variable, or it takes into account more than just the meteorological variables that actually come to influence how we are perceiving our thermal environments. So it takes into account those factors like the clothing, your level of clothing you're wearing, and the types of clothing you're wearing, as well as things like your activity rate, as well as your personal physiological factors. So the UTCI, so basically here, we looked at the UTCI model and we used the aerified heat data set, which I'll give some more details on this in a moment. And we just sought out to calculate the climatology across the region, as well as to look at trends. And when we looked at this UTCI, essentially we looked at the average daytime. We looked at the daily maximum, which is essentially a measure of, the maximum extent to which, the maximum extent and level of heat stress that we can experience during the day, as well as the daily minimum period, which was essentially the maximum extent of cold stress that you could experience during the evening. So when it comes to the Universal Thermal Climate Index model, I'm not going to go into it in depth, but essentially what it does is it takes into account air temperature, radiation, humidity, as well as wind speed. And together, these variables are then fed into a model that essentially considers aspects of the physiological, your physiological response to your outdoor environment, as well as the types of clothing that you're wearing. So when it comes to, so these are just some thoughts on the models. I'm not really going to go into detail, but essentially with the clothing model, it lays down the assumption that you're wearing clothing, your clothing type matches your outdoor environment. So if it's hot, you're not really going to be in like this fuzzy jersey, and if it's cold, you wouldn't necessarily be wearing shorts and t-shirts. And then it also takes into account aspects of your physiological response. So, if it's hot, you're going to be sweating, etc. And essentially, all of these factors, so it's meteorological factors, as well as the clothing model and the physiological model, are taken into account. And basically, the result is an equivalent temperature. Some people also refer to it as an current temperature, and it's supposed to represent how we essentially feel the outdoor, the real feel of the outdoor environmental conditions. So it's not just a temperature, but it's like the temperature affected by other variables. So it ranges from extreme heat stress to extreme cold stress. And in the middle, there's this class of no thermal stress, which is essentially said to model the thermally favorable environment for us. And at these varying levels, there are different types of protection measures that are suggested. To what extent should you supplement with liquids? Should you be in an air-conditioned room? Should you remain in a shaded area? How much physical activity should you undertake? In cold instances, do not undertake physical activity. And then, there's that aspect of staying indoors as well, and, don't expose yourself to the outdoors. And then at no thermal stress, of course, there's no thought on, adaptation and protection measures. So the reason we used the aerified heat data set for this was because the radiant temperature essentially was a problem when it comes to the weather station data. So, we looked at weather station records, but in most instances, it's not actually measuring radiant temperature or any factors of radiation. So basically, then it makes the model null. So it's almost as if this UTCI model cannot necessarily be applied to Southern Africa's weather station records, because in some instances, there's even cases where, weather stations are not measuring more than rainfall and temperature, for instance. So there's that consideration there. So the data set itself, currently it spans 1940 to present. but we use a subset of it, or at least at the time of our study, it only spanned 1979 to present. So we decided to use this data set for that then, and essentially the data set draws from the aerophile analysis and draws on variables of air temperature, humidity, and wind speed, as well as various measures of radiation. So the radiation measures are used to calculate the mean radiant temperature, and then that together with air temperature, humidity, and wind speed is used to calculate the actual UTCR model, and that gives us our thermal comfort index, being the universal thermal climate comfort index, as well as our equivalent temperature out of that. And the data set is it's a global data set. It has a 0.25 degree resolution, so it's not really a high resolution data set. Zooming into certain locations, you know, it's a 27 kilometer resolution. So in that instance, where the station records definitely prevail. So here are some results. And as I said, we looked at the climatology. I didn't actually mention that. We looked at the annual and monthly climatology. And so this was over the daily average, the daily maximum, as well as the daily minimum. So the daily average was quite interesting because if you look at an annual scale, most of the country is painted in green. And essentially that's suggesting, or most of the subcontinent is in green, which is suggesting that there is no thermal stress, which was surprising to us initially. And then basically there are very small incidences of moderate heat stress as well as slight cold stress. Then you move on, you interrogate the data more, and we saw that, you know, from the summer months and the late and the spring months, we saw that there were wide extents of heat stress, really concentrated on more tropical low-lying regions. So definitely something that is expected. And moving to the cooler winter months, we saw that there was a wide extent of cold stress. And of course, you know, in higher lying regions, we'd expect wide extents of cold stress, and the highest intensity of cold stress was the moderate cold stress category. But, you know, we weren't necessarily satisfied with this daily average climatology, because then when you look at the daily maximum, you actually see that there are wider extents of heat stress. And looking at the summer months, almost none of the region has the green color. So that means that as a maximum measure of how we might feel in terms of heat stress during the daytime, during the summer months, there is basically a pattern of no regions with no thermal stress, and almost the majority of the country is characterized by strong heat stress. And looking over Northern Cape regions, where we've seen recent farm worker deaths due to heat stress, we see there's a level of very strong heat stress. And this is still the average. We further interrogated the data and looked at the frequency over just single grid cells, but I won't be presenting that. And then coming to the winter months, we could see that the no thermal stress category is quite widespread, which is not necessarily surprising, but at the same time, we would still expect some heat stress during these times. And again, this is the average. So then, as I said, we looked at the daily minimum. And of course, you know, no surprises, during the nighttime, cold stress would be a factor of playing more of a role. And essentially, cold stress is quite widespread, especially during the winter months, and where strong cold stress is reached, but moderate cold stress is most widespread. But during all months, we're experiencing cold stress in the winter. We're experiencing cold stress during the nighttime, and at the very least, you know, in the summer months, it's concentrated over higher lying regions. So we also decided to have a look at how our thermal climatology has changed. So on a daily average, much so red is indicating that trends are increasing, blue is indicating that trends are decreasing, and we used a 9-candle trend test, and this is just reporting on the same slope. And really what we see is that on an annual scale, the majority of the country is showing an increase in the UTCI equivalent temperature. And there are a lot of statistically significant trends. There's some decreasing trends, but really they're not significant. And during the summer months, so December to March is what we classified as summer here, you know, we are seeing some increases, but there are also decreases. So then this also brings into question like the validity of reanalysis sometimes in terms of calculating trends. But despite this, if you look at the October and the September months, those are very concerning. I mean, in October 2022, there was a heat wave that influenced many parts of the central interior of South Africa and up into other adjacent regions. So we're seeing increases in the UTCI equivalent temperatures. And another thing is the cooler months, we're also seeing increases. So June and May are also quite, the increasing trends are widespread as well. There are lots of statistically significant trends. So at a daily maximum scale, the trends are basically the same. The spatial pattern is similar. The extent to which the decreasing trends occur on an annual scale is a bit more widespread. But again, months like October and September they are standing out as months where thermal stress influences or occurrences such as heat stress, basically, they're increasing. And also during the May and June months, again, they're standing out. So then we decided to look at as well as the daily minimum, and a similar pattern is seen, but at night we're seeing that there's widespread increasing trends, and in essence, there were very few, if any, decreasing trends on an annual scale. And during the June as well was a month that stuck out, but December and January in particular, and even February and March were months that really stuck out. So, you know, what this is really all suggesting is that Southern Africans have been, at least since 1979, we've been increasingly exposed to heat stress. So, I mean, this is nothing new to us, because many studies have shown this, and many studies have come to inform things like our national health guidelines on extreme heat planning. But what I really am trying to highlight here is that results from a study like we've just done, they're important to really go through with updating these health guidelines. And when it comes to heat stress, we all need to be concerned, because it's easy enough to say that soils aren't necessarily giving us enough warnings, but to a good extent, they're definitely providing us with warnings on when heat waves occur. And at the very least, we need to be more vigilant of this, because it is on our onus to consider heat stress. And, you know, there are various measures that we can apply basically to cope with heat stress, and we just really need to consider these. And another important thing is that we really need to consider these for those most vulnerable populations, especially when a lot of our adaptation strategies are suggesting for move indoors to air-conditioned rooms, but in many parts of Southern Africa, that's not an option. So yeah, so we really just need to take more care in terms of heat stress. And thank you very much.
So it's Masiru for the summer, and probably Maputo for the winter, right? That's a good place to be comfortable. Thanks very much. That's really, really interesting. Are there any particular questions or points people want to raise? Patrick, you've used up your time.
I'd like to hear.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. I'm just curious to know, among the kind of 4 variables, such as temperature, humidity, or wind, is there one of these variables that kind of emerge as the primarily controlling the salinity and spatial distribution of the UTCI, or they're all equally contributing to it?
That's a really great question, actually. So there are some studies out there that have looked at this, but we haven't actually looked at this, and this is something I want to consider further. To what extent, because it's going to differ from area to area, but to what extent are these different variables driving our UTCI equivalent temperature? And I would imagine that there are also variables also going to differ by season as well, perhaps, you know. So yeah, it's something I haven't looked at yet, but definitely on the cards.
Will the ARC allow you to do that?
Yes, if I relate it to public buckets.
Right. Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah, I'm also curious, on defining the RTCI, why we don't use, some biomarkers in the model?
What do you mean, what kind of biomarkers?
For example, so it's about individual, expression of, the ambient, temperature. As I used the apparent temperature when I did my PhD studies. So I kept on asking myself, we're talking about the physiological expression of, individual physiological expression of the ambient temperature. It's quite important that in the model, we express the biological, for example, the blood, high blood pressure, okay? The blood pressure of the individual, the insulin level of the individual. These are biomarkers that can help you to understand the reaction, this physiological reaction from the against the ambient temperature. But in the model, it doesn't exist. I also use it. I didn't see the biological model. It's humidity, window, and the ambient temperature, and then you define your apparent temperature.
Yeah.
Basic, but
So there are some biomarkers. There is a physiological model that's incorporated into this. You know, I didn't really go into the details of this, but the physiological model is really, it's really an assumptive model. It's not necessarily accounting for biomarkers like levels of insulin. And I guess this is really difficult in itself to model, because you're saying you use this apparent temperature, which if I'm correct, I understand that it only relies on meteorological variables and it doesn't actually bring into that. So it relies on these similar meteorological variables. Am I correct? Yeah. So I think that's very difficult to model. And if I'm to be honest, I don't really know how to model for those outliers. And it's really taking an assumptive point of view, where it's just assuming that everybody's kind of fine and it's not accounting for those outliers of people, but definitely a valid point.
You know, there's the standard relationships that are assumed to work, but it would be very interesting to go to those farm workers and put some monitors on them and try and do some physiological work.
I think I'm not the person to speak
No.
to, and I think this Dr. Carity right over there has the expertise there, and yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. We're going to move on to our last presentation before tea. Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
My level is up next, and I want to urge you all to ask the team to get back here as soon as he's over. I'll tell you when that is later. But so my level is actually technically a postdoc, but also a PhD student. She's in an amazing position. But she's working with us in the IDF project, and she's stationed at Source. So thanks very much for that.
Okay, before I started my presentation, I just wanted to comment about what you were saying with biomarkers. I think that is one of the limitations of epidemiological studies, because most of them we do them at ecological level, at population level. So it's a different challenge. Okay. Hi everyone, and thank you, Dr. Nello, for introducing me. I'll be presenting one of the chapters of my PhD thesis titled Seasonal and Weather Type Modification of the Association between Temperature Variability and hospital admissions in Cape Town, South Africa. And before I continue with my presentation, I just want to highlight that this is an extension of a recently published study which focused on the health risks of temperature variability. And I would like to acknowledge all my supervisors and co-authors. This is a paper that is a work in process. So yeah. So a number of epidemiological studies have been conducted around the world, and they attributed non-optimal temperature extremes such as extreme cold temperatures, apparent temperature, and other weather indexes to increased risks of health outcomes such as mortality and hospital admissions. However, most of those studies were conducted in developed countries, with a few studies conducted in Africa and fewer studies conducted in South Africa. And with those studies that were conducted in South Africa, or Africa as a whole, very few of them focused on, or rather assessed the effect of temperature variability on health outcomes. And temperature variability is one of the important indicators of climate variability or climate change. I've had the whole discussion about the proper use of terms. So, and also, there are few studies that considered or that investigated the synergetic effects of other meteorological and environmental factors, such as air masses, on temperature variability and health outcomes. So methods such as synoptic methods such as the SSC or spatial synoptic classification has been applied to address such limitations. So just to briefly highlight what the SSC is, it is based on the Vegan edge mass classification. It is similar, but it's not the same. The difference is that with the Vegan mass classification, they classify the day's weather condition according to the upper level conditions, whereas with the SSC, they focus more on the ambient weather conditions, such as relative humidity, such as dew point and daily temperature and other variables at station level. So the objectives of my study then are to describe the terminological characteristics of SSC weather types in Cape Town, and also to identify which weather types dominated during our study period, and furthermore to examine the association between temperature variability and hospital admissions within the distinct weather type categories. And the map to the right is the map that shows the location of the private hospitals where I obtained my data. So, I use secondary data for my analysis. So I obtained the health outcome data from 7 private hospitals located in Cape Town, as I mentioned. And the health outcomes of interest that I focus on are cardiovascular diseases and respiratory diseases, but I only focus on non-communicable diseases. And I obtained the meteorological and air quality data from the South African Weather Service and SAPRIS. In regards to the SSC data, we collaborated with Prof. Sheridan Scott, who is one of the pioneers of the SSC classification system. So I only focus on 7 weather types, and I further in my study hypothesized that the association between TB and the health outcomes, they depend on the level of moisture and the level of temperature. Hence, I recategorize the weather types from humidity standpoint and from temperature standpoint. So, and that accounts as part of sensitivity analysis. In environmental epidemiology, one of the most important things to do before you can start your study is to clearly define your exposure variable. So for my study, as I mentioned, the exposure variable is temperature variability, and I defined it using a composite index of intraday and interday temperature variability, which takes into account the variation that happens within a day and several days after exposure, other than the other temperature variability indexes such as diurnal temperature, which only focuses on what happens within that same day of exposure. And we calculated using the standard deviation of the minimum and maximum temperature during exposure days. And I won't go into detail in how I ran my model, but to summarize, I used quasi-Poisson regression model to estimate the risks of temperature variability on the health outcomes. So as I mentioned, there are two main objectives of my study: to see whether certain modifies the association between TB and the health outcomes, and also to evaluate or check whether the different weather types also modifies the association. So this is the model that I used. It is the same model that I used in my previous study. I used the same model options, but I adjusted a little bit. One of the discussions that we had yesterday, where Christian also mentioned that sometimes when we run this model, we do not account for other factors that might have influence on the risks. So in epidemiology, it's very known that there are confounders that we have to take into account when we're assessing the relationship between weather variables and health outcomes. So we can see that in my model, I included day of the week, public holiday, relative humidity, time, and time is a variable that we use to control for seasonality and trends. And also, literature has shown that the relationship between temperature variability and health outcomes can be confounded by temperature. So, so we added a non-linear across basis function for temperature to the model. And this term controls for the delayed and non-linear effects of temperature. So then when coming to the results, we observed that most of the CBD hospital admissions occurred during the warm season. And for obvious reasons, RD hospital admissions were high during the cold season. And we were able to identify that the most dominant weather types during our study period are dry, moderate, and moist tropical weather conditions. And the graph below just shows the frequency distribution of the weather types per season. So yeah, this is one of the main results. As I've mentioned, I've stratified a lot. I analyzed like for so many categories. So in that case, it's much easier to present your results as a box plot. So I'll try to explain it. On the x-axis, you can see those are our weather types. From the first one, which is DM to T1, that is the 7 classical weather type categories. Then the following 3 are the weather types that I defined from humidity standpoint, and the last 4 weather types are the ones that I defined from temperature standpoint. So when I interpret this, so visually we can see that I don't have a highlighter, but there's oh, okay, thank you. So we can see that the risks are higher for the 15 to 64 years age group, like when we are just looking overall. But then if you check according to the 7 weather types, we see that yes, the risks are still higher for that certain age group. However, during dry, moderate weather conditions, the risks are higher for the elderly. And the interpretation is still kind of the same for the other weather types. But however, the results were not significant during transitional days when I defined from a humidity standpoint, and similar trends were still observed for when I defined from a temperature standpoint. So for my study, I assessed for several legs or for several exposure days. So this one, it was after 2 days of exposure. So in the next graph, it's after 7 days of exposure or at a longer leg. So for this, we still observe the same trend, but however, the magnitude of the risks now decreases. And in some instances, for example, during the dry, moderate weather type, or during the MP, which is a moist polar weather type, the risks now are insignificant. So this just highlights the fact that it's really important, like, to assess your results for different legs so that we don't end up missing important information. So this is the graph for respiratory hospital admissions, same interpretation. And here the same age group was still vulnerable overall, but however, the 0 to 14 years age group were more vulnerable during the dry polar weather conditions. So in the next slide, well, I just wanted to reiterate the importance of assessing for different legs or different exposure days, other than just looking at 1 day of exposure or same day of exposure. So we can see that in the first block, when I analyze, when I ran the model for the whole year or for the whole period, the results were all significant. However, when I stratified according to season, we can now see that the results are only significant for during the warm season. And also, according to the 7 weather types, the results were only significant at shorter exposure days during most tropical weather conditions. And they were significant at longer exposure days for dry, when the humidity levels were dry. Yeah, and the same interpretation for tropical weather types. So the results when coming to RD or respiratory hospital admissions, they are quite different. With this one, we observe immediate risks. So we observe the highest risks at shorter legs, even though we can see during the cold season, we have delayed risk rate. So yes, literature, it does sometimes, it does support that. that sometimes you can have this, especially for respiratory diseases. Maybe people took some time to go and consult. It might be one of the reasons, but yeah, and maybe not. So in summary, I was able to identify the most frequent weather types and the risk of cardiovascular diseases was higher during the warm season, and the risk respiratory hospital admissions was strongly associated with temperature variability, especially at long exposure days, and also a significant significant increases for CBD and RV hospital admissions appeared during moist tropical and dry weather conditions. And from humidity standpoint, high risk were observed during moist days. So in conclusion, I was able to identify that age, season, and zoonotic air masses or weather types do modify the association between TB and health outcome. So I think it is very important that we consider applying such methods in epidemiology so that we can see how atmospheric circulation patterns and how air masses affect our health. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it's very nice and clear. I want to see if there are any questions besides the two of you. I'm giving Cody a chance.
Thank you, that was very interesting. I'm curious to know why you chose the age cutoff for 15 and that you looked at 15 to 65 and older than 65 in total, but you didn't look at children separately.
That is only for cardiovascular diseases. I didn't look for the 0 to 14 years age group because there were few observations. So yeah.
I'm going to cut the conversation right here. It's tea time. And you guys are going to talk afterwards. But before you go, you are all going to participate like this. Now, I know that you're all coming back after tea for the very important panels of Juan's presentation. And then panel discussion. We really want your input on this idea. So please come back. If you're not going to come back, I'll know who you are. Please would you bring those to the front. And we will see you promptly at 29 minutes past 4. Thank you. Okay, we're going to pick up, folks. So the last input, and it was the best is last, is from Okone, who's a student at Wits University, and also on the Apex project. So I'm going to give you the floor for 20 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon to you all. So I know it's been a very long day. I trust all of you well. We've had lunches, we've had refreshments, and so I was really hoping for a less turnout, but we're here now, and the show must go on. My name is Okone Motahala. I'm from the School of Geography, Archaeology, and Environmental Studies from the University of the Witwatersrand. I'm supervised by Professor Jennifer Fetchers, who's also from this. Dr. Neville Swain, who's going to answer all my questions on my behalf. Dr. Robert Time, and together we're exploring the role of climatic seasonality in the peak incidence of respiratory diseases in South Africa. And so the results and the work done we're presenting today was recently published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. And it's defined, it's rather, entitled Defining the South African Acute Respiratory Infectious Disease Season. I want to thank my co-authors, Professor Jennifer Fish, who's not here, and Dr. Neville Smith, who's in the middle of there. So if you do want to have a chat later on about this, find out more about it, please, feel free to speak to me or email me. So let's get the show on the road. So infectious diseases are also known as non-communicable, as communicable diseases rather, and are the second leading cause of death. And we have our low respiratory diseases that contribute significantly to the global mortality rate. And this was definitely the case in COVID-19. And various studies have demonstrated a direct link between respiratory disease and season. However, it's not yet clear whether these patterns exist in South Africa. And that's what we were trying to explore in this paper here. And this is also exacerbated because there is little standardization in how to define the onset and timing of the season. So in 2017, the Center of Disease Control and Prevention outlined and adopted a new methodology for classifying the flu season. And it's based on data from past flu seasons. So the CDC used key flu indicator data to develop intensity thresholds to classify the severity of flu season and to set a specific threshold to delineate the start and the end of the flu season. So therefore, an intensity threshold is a value developed using data from the past seasons that help assess the probability that an influenza indicator would exceed the threshold. And for the purpose of this, the manuscript, we looked at two case studies. There was one in the CDC, and they said that for the first flu case in the country, that's the beginning of the flu season, right? And then there was a European study that stated that they use a 5% threshold to delineate the start and the finish of the flu season. But furthermore, we have the NICD that states that for the past 30 years, we've had a 19-month influenza season in South Africa. And I think it's very important to understand the start and the ending of the seasons due to climate, because climate change represents a massive threat to respiratory health. Number one, it promotes or aggravates respiratory diseases. And secondly, it increases the exposure to risk factors for respiratory diseases. How are we going about doing that? So for this presentation, I used 3 data sets. The first one was from the Scary Health Medical Aid Schemes, and those were the claims, so coded under ICD-10. So these were individuals, hypochondriacs such as myself, who go to the doctor and say, I've got symptomatics, I've flu symptoms rather, and it was they were diagnosed like that. And then we have the second data set, which was about one case hospital data set. So these were individuals in hospital that tested positive for either influenza or RSV. And then lastly, we looked at the public's perception of the seasonality of respiratory diseases. So let's get started to see how we looked at determining these thresholds. So firstly was to identify if there was a seasonality in the medical insurance claim and hospitalization cases. Then it was the total for them tabulated and plotted, commencing from the first week of the year 2008 to the last week of the year 2019. Then we started calculating and plotting a 5-point running mean for each province and for one of the hospital cases respectively. Then now we started using the claims in isolation and to assess the start and end dates of the seasons and when we started. Then we started the thresholds were then calculated as percentages of the annual mean total number of cases for each province. And then the study I mentioned previously, that's the European one rather, that spoke to a 5% threshold. We then applied the 5% threshold to define the onset and the cessation of the influenza season. But then we went to get a step further and we looked at, we tested various thresholds rather, that resulted in the 19, well, as close as possible to the 19 flu season as suggested by the NICD. Our study side. So we looked at the whole of South Africa because there's considerable climate heterogeneity across the country. Hot and dry and arid conditions in the west, and warm, wet and humid conditions in the east. So rainfall occurs in summer rather across much of the country, but the southern western is characterized by winter rainfall and the southern west coast by all year rainfall. When we look at the National Department of Health in South Africa, it is in charge of overseeing, coordinating, and setting policies for the nation's health services. So we have a two-tiered, severely unequal healthcare system, where it's public and private. So 71% of South Africans rely on the government to give their healthcare, and this was mentioned by Fisher and also by Dr. Karen Wright as well. And then we've got roughly 27% of individuals who are able to pay out of pocket when they are ill, or they can afford medical aid or rather medical insurance, as some people call it. So our first set of results, we looked at the hospital results that we obtained. So influenza over here and the RSV hospitalization rates at Baragwanath indicate that cases peaked during the early autumn to winter seasons from 2015 all the way to 2019. Okay. And there's a distinct seasonal peak in cases per year that can be observed in both RSV and in influenza. However, it is more observable in RSV. This is for the following reasons. RSV is from the pediatric ward, right? So this is the children's ward, basically. And first of all, it is the leading cause of bronchitis and lower respiratory tract illness in children. Second of all, most kids or children have an underdeveloped immune system. And lastly, the transmissions occur more frequently due to shared spaces such as classrooms and playgrounds. When we look at our medical scheme data, we look at Gauteng separately first. So there's a distinct seasonal pattern that is observed in Gauteng. So Gauteng is the most densely populated province and the climate hub of the country, and consists of individuals who can essentially afford medical aid and medical health insurance. But from 2015 to 2019, RSV and flu cases peaked during the winter, so it's around the previously seen here. However, unlike Baragwanath, which looked at cases that were tested, there's a claim each and every single week for our discovery about the disease data. And so it was important that to look at not just Gauteng and isolation, but other provinces as well, because all 9 provinces will exhibit like a different distinct seasonality. We have the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal that all exhibit a distinct seasonality. And it's ironic because all of those are situated around the coast. Perhaps we'll talk, further into this. But we do have the Northwest that does also exhibit a distinct seasonality. However, the Free State, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and the Northern Cape do not exhibit such a distinct seasonality in comparison to the others. So when we finally got to the crux of it, so we looked at our actual threshold analysis, when we applied the European studies 5%. So apologies for my graph. They've been here for a good time, not a long time. The year goes down every year, and then this is the week, and then you can see that we applied the 5% to all 9 provinces. And it's very clear to see that the flu season basically spans for the whole year. The Eastern Cape, the Free State, Gauteng, the KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, Northwest, Northern Cape, as well as in the Western Cape. So we had to test for specific threshold that would work well for South Africa to yield those that 19 flu season according to the NICP. And what we were able to obtain is for the Eastern Cape, we got 17%. For the Free State, 15%. For Gauteng, we got 20%. For KZN, 5%. For Limpopo, 15%. For Mpumalanga, 15% threshold. For Northwest, 13%. For the Northern Cape, 11%. And for the Western Cape, 18%. Now, when we look to see the public's perception on how they perceive respiratory diseases. We asked the question in the online survey is, do you perceive or do you believe that a respiratory disease is associated with a certain time of year? And from all 9 provinces, everyone agreed that yes, we believe that we get sick at a specific time of year. When asked what time of year you think you get sick, we had 15% responding saying it was autumn, 67% saying winter, 14.8% saying spring, 5.1% saying summer, and then 2.1% saying any time of the year. Right. So, indeed, there is a distinct seasonality in climate and claims related to respiratory diseases. And across South Africa, seasonality influences a wide range of activities that contribute largely to the economy. However, there's little consensus on the timing of the seasonal boundaries. So, seasonality is more distinct in certain provinces as opposed to others, and is more easily detectable where there are large population densities and extreme cities, such as Johannesburg, for example. And the threshold varies significantly across seasons. And I think it's important to note that a disease's potential to cause an outbreak determines whether it should be under surveillance. So there is value in monitoring case numbers in less severe diseases. This allows for better communication with the public and the preparation of health facilities. While it would be very costly to have high resolution surveillance of the type instituted for COVID-19, where extensive testing occurred, medical insurance data provided a proxy by which this can be continued or carried out rather. So cases and claims increased during the winter season, and these findings align with the perceptions of the public, as the majority of the public associate respiratory seasons with the winter and believe that climate plays a role in determining when one is at risk of contracting a respiratory disease. In conclusion, the respiratory disease season is predominantly in the winter season and ends in the summer for all 9 provinces in South Africa. Each province has a different threshold that will be a respiratory disease season. It is roughly 19 weeks long. And thirdly, it is important to understand the temporal patterns of epidemiology and understanding the public's perception of the seasonality of respiratory diseases and the role of climate in triggering those. So, understanding public perceptions offer potential pathways and targets for interventions to encourage protective and preventative health measures. So, anecdotally, if you're not feeling well, you go and mask. And lastly, I think it's very important to advocate for a particular classification of the acute respiratory disease season. It's very important. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Well done. Okay, since I'm co-author, I'm not going to ask you any questions. I currently have a question, then we'll take one over there. I want to get to the discussion part of the meeting quickly. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I think I have 2 questions and they might be interrelated. So, what do you think is the novelty of this word? So the novelty, the first thing was that, so people have done this, but from my understanding in South Africa, with the NICD in particular, because that's where we can get our frameworks from, they had not used intentional personal methodologies, and neither had they spoken, or from what I could have seen or what I was looking for, there was no one that was telling us the exact beginning. So everyone would say it is in winter, but no one could say it starts in week 24 and going straight into 52. So I think that was a novelty that I could see at the time.
Okay, thank you. And then the second one is, if I understand correctly, you use sort of time series method. Is it really, it's a time series with something a running mean or something?
So I would not say it was a time series. I would say that it's not a time series. I think that's to come, what I'm saying, we are looking at to come. It was a 5-point running mean and a threshold analysis.
Yeah, I was just interested whether you thought that was a sufficiently appropriate to use And whether, and you just mentioned now you could do time series, but there's something a bit more sophisticated. Looks like such a rich data set to explore and to just do such simple analyses. But if it's exploratory and you go into more, then that's very good.
No, thank you so much for that comment. We definitely are going to do more. And there were, like I said, other methodologies that were more like your packages. But I think it was a co-author thing that there was general consensus. But I think for the purpose of this paper, for the purpose of the objective, this was the most appropriate method at the time.
Two questions quickly. Thanks for the presentation anyway. It was very nice. Okay, so first question, why do you think it is easily detectable in high density areas? Is that what you said, right? Yeah, that's why is it easily detectable in high density areas? And the second one is, what would you like to tell the health sector system to do about your research? Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. Can I start with the second question? So the nice thing is what we're doing is basically risk analysis. So I can't remember whose talk was it, but someone mentioned that it's so good and well to be in a situation and say there's a warning system. So I think what we're trying to do at the end of the day is say, here's the data, here are the early warning systems. So to prevent it before it comes. And I think with the high density cities, I think it's just easy to think about more people. So you can see the pattern and the seasonality data, whereas often high density cities are also making hubs as well. So people could, in this case, the medical aid could afford. You could definitely see rather than seasonality data than the new density.
I need to stop the conversation right here. I need to get to the, do you want to make a,
It's difficult. I think I would like to answer to the question of on the novelty. But I picked up what you said in the morning, that we have to associate qualitative research with quantitative evidence.
It's okay, your answer was still good. I thought that was the novelty.
So in terms of a warning system, it's helping us when we can start with the warning system. I mean, the population will pick it up very quickly in the public health approach. The population will pick up quickly because it's their protection, it's their response. So they know already that okay, there is onset of influenza. So whatever that we talk tell them, to say that let's go for what the public health system will tell us.
Thank you.
thank you, and thank you for your time. What I want to say is that, you know, these data are quite complex because they represent quite different socioeconomic groups, and the way people report and they claim is also very varied. So it does complicate things. But I'm going to need to move on so that we can finish in time for and we won't be that long, I promise. What I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to tell you about this concept of the REACH Alliance that we are proposing. And then I'm going to ask our panel, we've got Katlego, we've got Tandy, and we've got Bono, who should be online, and we've got Michelle Group online from the NICD. We'll get them to give some points, and then we can open the discussion. And the little pieces of paper I need to get from you so that I can show that people actually were here. I did actually have an opinion, but I've got it recorded too. Okay, so I wanted to say why this idea. And I think today we saw a really exciting variety of research on a whole range of different topics. And the research gaps that Cody identified, some of the work we do, we are seeing today pertains to this. This is a sample of what's going on in South Africa. We know that there are lots of other people involved in health and climate and health research and climate and environmental research. But I think, and I hope you would agree with me, that it's fairly fragmented. And there are opportunities like those that we saw from Madeleine, that it would be helpful to coordinate or to at least to shop, you know, in the sense that we can workshop those ideas. And this, I guess, belongs to not just the thing in and of itself, but belongs to other systems, as I might have mentioned earlier. The National Framework for Climate Services has, as part of its design, user interface platforms. It needs users, and it needs practitioners, and it needs climate scientists to be able to provide a good service. So what we are conceiving is a partnership anchored, and I use the word anchored because it's not only them, but the key institutions here are the MRC, which has a medical mandate, the Weather Service, which has a climate mandate, NICD, which has a disease and Department of Health disease mandates, disease management mandates, are the three sort of key elements of this idea. And then the idea would be that we would have a broad range of different kinds of partners, which I've tried to depict in this image here. And this image says, you know, here we've got MRC, we've got the Department of Health, we've got SOARS, and then there's a range of different types of organizations that can help us organize our thinking and organize our planning. So academia, private sector health, very important, individual researchers, research groups, public research institutions, disaster risk management, and other government departments, just to be as sort of broad as I can. And what would the whole idea be about? What is it that we seek to do? Well, we want to get a membership comprising of stakeholders, as described above, assist with the development of, and further development, I should say, enhancement and updating and engaging with the National Climate and Health Research Strategy, in particular focus on research, collate and disseminate information on all existing climate and health research in South Africa and in the region and in the continent, disseminate and where appropriate, organize responses to funding calls, raise funding for research among the partnerships, develop channels for communication of research outputs to stakeholders and decision makers, organize research responses to emerging climate and health challenges. It might be in the short term, the medium or long term, organize regular scientific events and opportunities to interact like this one, but on a more regular basis, and potentially represent the climate and health research community, our membership, in official processes such as the NFCS or the National Communication. That's kind of the broadest kind of scope of what we're thinking about. And then, wait, there's one more slide. I thought there was another one. No. Yes, so that's really what the kind of idea is. And how it would work really depends on the membership. And why I think this is a good opportunity is because it is a low-hanging fruit. We know ultimately that climate change impacts are ultimately felt in human health, one way, directly or indirectly, as you were talking about this morning. And so this is the opportunity we're looking to try and get better organized, and to follow on from some of the initiatives that have taken place in the past. That's enough said about the concept of REACH, okay? I'm going to stop there and ask that our panel come forward. So that's Katria and Tandy, and please bring a chair with you. And Michelle is online. Is that Bono? Is that you? I think it is. Bono is there too. Bono, if you could put your video on, then we can see you. Okay, so hi Bono. Great. I'm really glad you're here. I think you're muted. Oh yeah, no, we can hear you. Okay, great. So what I thought we'd do is let's ask our panelists to express a point of view on both of the team today and potentially some thoughts about what their institutions are doing and what they think about this idea. So who wants to start? Should I pick on somebody? Okay, I've got two hands here, but yours was first. So Tandy is going to go first. I don't know if you can see it. Actually, I'll turn the camera so that you can see it then. There's something somewhere over there. Okay, so I'm going to give you the microphone and give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neville.
So I think I'll just start with one of the first things that I'm taking away today is from Kari's talk, is that we need to work on the quality of health data. So the first thing is we need data that allows us to fully look at the health impacts of climate change on health. I think the main challenge we have, or one of the challenges we have, is that we can't really classify deaths properly in relation to climate change. For instance, if you're looking at deaths that are to do with heat exposure, for instance, in the Stats SA database, they only had like 10 deaths that were due to heat exposure. That's not possible at all, looking at the recent heat waves that we've had. And I would also be interested to see how they classified the deaths of those farm workers in the Northern Cape, because we know that was due to direct heat exposure, but you know, they might have misclassified those. There was also the case of a 9-year-old child from the UK who had asthma, and a coroner ruled her death as due to air pollution exposure, because of the area she lived in, where there were PM levels above the WHO limits, you know. So I think those are things that would really help us in quantifying the severity and the extent of the impacts of climate change on health. That's the one thing. The other thing is that we had an email from a reporter a while back, Cardi, who was working on advocating on classifying climate change as a cause of death. So I think that's something that we really need to look at. It was a reporter for Nature, the Nature Journal. The other thing was a point raised by Christian. He was talking about how we need to make sure that our methods are up to par. Who's Nada still here?
She's online.
Nada is a statistician, and she will tell you the importance of thorough methods that you can account for, that you can back up, because that's the only way we can actually quantify the risks of the impacts of climate change. The other thing was the point raised by Madeleine Thompson, I think, about funding. And I think from that, we can see that funders are looking at teams that have diverse groups of people. So this goes to Neville's point about having this platform like REACH, you know, that has people like various backgrounds, various skills, because that I think is what funders are more open to funding these days. Also, in my previous life, I used to work at the Malaria Research Unit, which is where I met Neville as well. So I was really interested in the talks by Nada, Michael, and Martinez.
Patrick.
About looking at the climate drivers of malaria. Was really interesting. So those are my main.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, we're going over to Patrick from Swords. We're gonna go climate, health, no. Health, climate, never mind. Carry on.
Thank you so much, Deborah. What I'm taking away today is that we really need to look at new analysis techniques that will take into consideration both qualitative and quantitative research method and approach. But again, there's an issue of data, you know, and also methodologies and techniques that can be applied. But at the end of the day, we need to get to that point whereby we have both social data as well as data from other sectors as well, so that it can enable us to do impact-based studies, which is key. I think weather service has started to do some work in that front. Even our focusing now, we've moved away from what the weather will be to what the weather will do. We have made a lot of strides, but again, there's a whole lot of things that we can take. Many examples, like for example, the UK and floods. That warnings were not issued. They were issued, warnings were issued. But again, it's like it's like a race, whereby where the service can do up to a certain point. But there are also other parties and key players that also need to come to the fore. You know, we can issue those warnings, but again, we also need to understand the psyche of people. And that's where we come to talk about translating or repackaging the very scientific work that we see into easy understandable products and services, which will allow people to take the necessary action, like in case of 10. So what happened there is that people were just given warning, but then the fact that no one is giving them an alternative to say you can now go to this particular location, people will remain, you know, in their safe space, only to be exposed to the floods. So that's one for me, qualitative and quantitative methods we need to do that. We know that we have done climate models, you know, are doing great, particularly in regions where we have limited observations. But I think there's also an issue of uncertainty. So that also brings us back into us incorporating both observation and climate data, so that we're able to get to a point whereby we create, you know, more accurate and robust tools to enable us to deal with issues of climate change and variability. Still on that point, there are other, you know, competing needs, even within the research basis. There are socio-economic factors and dynamics, you know. So we also need to reprioritize as a country and put the resources, particularly where there is high vulnerability. But then we have to know what are those vulnerabilities. So it takes us back to impact studies, you know. So we need to know where exactly we should direct which resources, so that we are able to, you know, create safer lives for our people. Lastly, issue of data, it's a problem, and the weather service is always crucified for not providing data. Where there are economical challenges, our government grant is shifting each year, but then we are getting to that point. We are trying. There's a lot that we need to do also in our own observation structures, and we are currently trying to look into research into even the actual instrumentation that we use to collect data. We are also looking at model development here in South Africa, which is key, because currently most of the models that we use are from overseas. You know, so we need to also increase that capacity locally, so that together we can try and find climate change and save our people. There's a whole lot of things I wrote that I think.
Well, thank you. I mean, there's a lot more to respond to, which I'm very tempted to, but yesterday in the session we had on extreme events, we did speak about the data issue extensively and noted that there are ways around the problem. This is climate data issue.
Yes.
And also that there's a change of policy on the horizon. You know, that's on the horizon, and that depends on a couple of things which lots of us are involved in. But thank you very much.
Yeah, that's one.
Yes, go ahead.
And we need social scientists. I think it will be good that also we also consider to have social scientists who will really help us, you know, to try and assist our people. So maybe we should start looking at, you know, collaborate partners who are from the social science who will really help us, because we really need to.
On the executive committee of REACH, you make that decision. First official decision.
Okay, thank you so much.
Let's move on to Michelle from NICD, Michelle Groom. Floor is yours for a while. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon to everyone, and apologies I couldn't be there in person. Seems Bloemfontein is a very popular place at the moment, and floods were hard to come by. So from an NICD perspective, really great to see some of the NICD data that has been used, especially the respiratory data. Sorry to hear that the malaria data was not as easy to come by. And I think this really just speaks to even, looking at trying to integrate disease surveillance. And I think that's really across partners, and we're really trying.
No. She can load shed it. But you wouldn't be, not at 5 o'clock. Huh? 5 o'clock. Oh,
Sorry, you lost me there, sorry.
just for a second, carry on.
Sorry, so I'm talking about integrated disease surveillance. And so really one of the areas that we can really move, and especially in the malaria space, I know there's been a lot of work being done in terms of trying to integrate the different data sources so that we're working off the single data source. I think in terms of diarrhea, I think you presented on respiratory, but I think lots of work to be done on diarrheal surveillance and also on outbreaks. So I think we've got, the cholera outbreak at the moment in Southern Africa, high risk of these outbreaks, transferring across to South Africa with travel. And I think really there's a lot of untapped data sitting at the NICD where we really need collaborators. Looking at your modeling, I think we would need some assistance in terms of trying to get some of these models going. And I think really opportunity through REACH just to put the partners together and really to be able to see what we can come up with as a more inter and multidisciplinary team. I think speaking to the collection of data, I think also just collecting the right data. So I think obviously we are looking at it from an infectious disease perspective. We're collecting a lot of data on notifiable medical conditions, on laboratory. We have laboratory-based surveillance. But I think there might be opportunity to just check that the data that we're collecting is compatible with the questions that we want to ask. And so I think we really do need to be looking a bit, once again, from a multidisciplinary perspective, in terms of checking that our data fields are right. And I think one of the other speakers spoke to mortality, and I think that's definitely an area where we need better integrated data reporting. I mean, we saw even with COVID, I think the mortality stats, we had, the excess deaths, we had data from DAFCOP, data from the department, and those didn't always, speak to each other. So I think definitely integrated disease surveillance is needed. Yeah, so I think I agree also with the social scientists. I think really important that we integrate that, as well as being able to look at disease, climate, and also costing. So for example, with the floods, we were on the alert that there may be increasing diarrheal diseases, but I think if we can preempt some of that through our modeling, we would be able to also look at cost averted as well. So I think maybe that's where I'll stop for now. Neville, thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll go on to Bono, who has burdened with the responsibility of a policy around climate and health from the Department of Health, and he's a co-conspirator with me in this idea of the session. So Bono, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Neville, and afternoon, colleagues. I think one would want to apologize, and it would have been good for one to have attended physically and not miss all these engagements, because they are very important in the work that we are actually doing, which is policy development at a national Department of Health. And I think when one actually saw all the topics that were presented today, they were so much inclined with health, and it would have been good for one to have just participated and be able to engage the presentations. But nevertheless, because of other competing priorities, I'm grateful that I'm here just to share a word or two from the department itself. I think on the issue of research, it's very imperative that we are able to have researches that have been conducted, especially the papers that we presented today. They sort of give a baseline or information in terms of how policy need to be redirected. Because if you look at it,
currently we have, from the study that was done in 2019 in terms of trying to establish the researches that are available in the country that talks to climate change and health, we really had very limited researches. And I think that can also be something that can, we know that currently there is a whole number of people who are conducting research, and the story might be different because 2019 and now we are talking of more than almost 2 years, and things might have actually changed. The climate might have actually changed. So what is also key that maybe one can propose, which is something that I understand that Karadi is also there, which is what we have been discussing with Karadi, is that we need to have a platform where all researches that have been conducted, let's say for instance, the researches that have been conducted re climate change and health, if a person is in need of such, can easily be able to access them. Because currently the way it is, I can do my own research from my own academic perspective. And if it's not even published, it means no one will be able to know about it. And academics and also research institutions conduct their own researches, but we do not have a sharing platform. Up until maybe one can say, can we then request people to be able to share the research studies that they have done? And worst part is those that are never published, then it means no one will know about it. It will be that particular individual or the particular institution that will know about that particular research. So I believe that it's very key that we develop, and I'm hoping that this will be one of the objectives of REACH, to be able to sort of facilitate researches that have been conducted and have sharing platforms for us to be able to utilize such information. Because as I've indicated, it's very key for informing the direction of policy within the country itself. And I think one other area is that research is also part and parcel of the elements that are in our national climate change and health adaptation plan, and we really want to keep it moving. And I think we will definitely engage more as part of REACH to be able to make that activity to be actually implemented. Because sometimes we put in elements and we find that we are failing even to implement them. So with this opportunity, definitely we will definitely be able to achieve something with this particular engagement. We have also on the 23rd of March, if my memory serves me well, we are going to be having the National Climate Change and Health Steering Committee meeting. That will be our first meeting. And part of the agreement or our activities is that we need to have subcommittee. And one of the subcommittee will be a subcommittee that deals with the research. And definitely that subcommittee will then be able to engage with the REACH to ensure that we get to achieve what we want to achieve. We want to really utilize this information. And I think what I also gathered as I joined was the fact that issues of funding, I think already we have several institutions that are coming to the fore to approach the department to be able to endorse the research project that they have, and also source funding from donors. So if we can have such engagement and also through REACH, it will be much easier already to note that as a department, what is it that we are putting as a priority for a particular year in terms of researches that need to be done. That will also guide us in terms of programs or projects that we need to do in the communities to address issues of climate change and health. And I think the other element will be, this will also encourage collaboration among stakeholders. Currently, you find that researchers or different stakeholders, they operate, as I've indicated, in their silos, whereby you find that
Bono has done a research on climate change and health with key focus. I'll give an example, an apology. If I'll give an example that will already people are working on that particular project. We are looking at it related to pregnant women. Bono is doing it and her focus will be maybe in Gauteng. And then there's another individual then who is doing it in Gauteng, but in a specific district. Then there's another one, a similar project. So if there are those engagements, you might find that it's better if we have collaborated and even do the project not only for a specific community, but maybe even extend it and it becomes something for the entire province or even for the entire country, because resources would have been made available. So collaboration is very key. And I think what I also gathered from what Katiako has indicated, that as much as they share in terms of the warnings, there's nothing that is being done. So we really need to find areas, and I think through the steering committee, because that is what we want to address. When we receive from source the warnings, we share with provinces and municipalities, but whether that information gets to be utilized, it's something else. Maybe we need to find ways in terms of moving in and say, provinces, can we monitor how you are actually implementing this? I think, let me close by saying, I see Neville is up now. Let me close by actually saying that the other area that we are looking at is generation or developing the indicators. I think I had someone commenting on that one, and we are being supported. Katiako is part of that, and currently also part of that, and DFSE, Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. So from our side, I think it's very important that REACH gets to see the light of the day, so that we can be able to work smart to ensure that resources get to be utilized maximally, and we get information that will assist us as government to be able to develop policies that are proper and policies that will definitely be implemented. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Before everybody leaves, because we're running out of time, you can if you need to. I wanted to see if there's anything from the floor, any questions to our panelists, or any comments that you have. I see my level hand, and I want to just say that this is all going to fit together in a bigger picture, and I just want to paint that picture that there's, there's global change science policy. There was a discussion yesterday about the need for a climate research strategy. There's national framework for climate services. There's the steering committee that you spoke about, and then there's this initiative and various others. And we do need to make sure that they all fit together, that they make sense. Otherwise, they become themselves fragmented initiatives. Malebo has got the floor. You can ask a question of anyone or everyone.
Just wondering why state SA is not part of this, because social economic factors also play a role in climate vulnerability. Yeah.
You get the question. I'm guessing that I'm going to need to answer that. There's no reason that they're not involved, other than I haven't thought about it, so thank you. But in fact, just to add to your point, in Australia, the Climate Services setup there comprises the CSIRO, the Weather Bureau, and Australian Statistical Bureau. Those are the three organizations that make up the core of their climate services, for exactly the reason you wanted. So that's a very good idea. Other comments or questions? Both our panelists want to comment.
That was a great point. I also think that with regards to stats, they say the data that we have to use for those variables is so outdated. And I would like to know, how we can get more recent data for social economic variables.
Yeah, and also maybe to add to say that Stats SA currently sells data to us. But again, there are also platforms like easy data where you can get a socioeconomic at a good exorbitant amount. Like we find that you have to pay 120 something thousand to be able to get that data. But again, as a country, we need to redefine indicators for the different sections, whether it be population, the education level, because all those things they affect our income stats. But they are currently in
My question is for Kataho, but in announcement. We mentioned that for social scientists and qualitative work and research, how do you go about incorporating this? Because, for example, with like conference like this, we have so that every day on statistics and stuff like that. So how do you incorporate the two? Those points?
As the weather says, we are trying, in our research department, we recently introduced a social division, which help us in engaging with people, getting feedback, because most of the research is being out there, but we're not getting feedback, and we need that feedback into the research process again, so that we can be able, to get more accurate results. So at the end of the day, when we do impact studies, we have to look at them, at those socioeconomic, and there are models, I did a study with my PhD, whereby I actually use socioeconomic data and also use climate data, and we can actually incorporate those things if there are no and techniques.
Again, yesterday we talked about these supermodel ideas where you've got the core hazard being modeled and the core impact, but then, for example, in Durban, we were doing some interviews after that. The guy from the Housing Development Agency said to us, all I wanted to know was where can I move people now to an area which is habitable? That's what I want to know. And he didn't have that data at hand at the time. I want to finish at past, which is in a few minutes, and I just want to ask Michelle something. And in so doing, I want to actually relate a story. I got a call from your colleague, Lucille Bloomberg, in January about a case of a woman that got very ill and almost died, but has happily recovered since, while on holiday in Kilburg's River. And to this date, they have not diagnosed it. And the theory is that it was an environmental poison, an environmental toxin. But what the source was, was it a snake, scorpion, a spider, plant, what was it? She had a lesion behind her knee and the leg swelled up with organ failure, and she just made it. It's quite healthy now. There's still some pain down underneath. Nobody really knows what it was. So we looked around, we looked at everything we could. We looked at scorpion, we looked at all the experts. Nobody could come up with anything, except one person who said probably the symptoms fit a sting from a microscopic jellyfish, which actually is not known, is very rare in our part of the world. And this represents possibly first record of such an incident. And so, Michelle, this is talking about, for example, the zoonotic diseases and data around that kind of thing, because it is also important for us to look at, for example, the range. We heard some speeches today, some talks today about changing ranges of malaria, etc., etc. Is there good data on zoonotic diseases that you guys have that you could possibly throw into this pot?
Yeah, so we've got a very strong Center for Zoonotics. It's a very strong unit. I think there we really are trying to build, and I think it's one of the areas that is able to build the One Health. And so the head of our Center for Zoonotics is actually very involved in sitting on several, committees for One Health. And I think this is one area, and I think it was one of the first presentations, I can't remember. We're really trying to put, I think it was the one on the zoonotics, trying to, this One Health approach is really important. And so we are able to, at some stage, we get it when the person is actually affected. But I think it needs, broader integration, in terms of really trying to link in, the veterinary, the vets, and others in trying to have a holistic look at zoonotics. And I think, it was highlighted this morning in that talk as, we've seen it, far down that chain, that we really need to be able to look at these things a little bit further up the chain. So once again, I think it requires multidisciplinary kind of collaboration between our colleagues in environmental as well as the veterinary sphere. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done in terms of strengthening the zoonotic surveillance. Thanks, Neville.
Thank you. I want to draw to a close because the students have to get their buses off fast. I just want to see if there's any comments about the REACH concept in and of itself. I'm happy to take cautionary as well as support. If anyone has an opinion about it or wants to express anything, I'm going to give you a chance, other than what's already been said. Gone. Okay. So we're going to draw to a close. I thank you all very much. Thank you, Michelle, for hanging all day. Thank you, Paul, for being able to making the time with us. Thanks to all our speakers. And thanks to all our panelists. And
Hello, Napo. Napo. Can you hear me?
thank you for that.
So.
Then I need.
I don't think you can though.
Janelle. Yes. You're from Little Cat. Are you? Okay, I'm going to tell you, I'll catch you up there. Ask me later. I might not go anywhere. I might just stay here until okay. Thank you, everybody. Just your opinion can go there. Thank you.
Waving.
I'll give you my business card. Please.
You want to try you know the whole book, I think they need you.
Yes. For you, thank you. Did I stop recording? I did. I can now close this meeting. I can find my mouse. For some reason my mouse doesn't want to work.
Can you hear us?
There we go. End.